What if the downfall of a Latin American strongman could shake the Kremlin? Venezuela is often dismissed as a local tragedy, a nation of blackouts, shortages, and a leader clinging to power. But beneath that chaos lies a secret that Washington and Kyiv have been watching closely, a way to pressure Putin. This story is about more than Venezuela. It's about the fragile lifeline linking Nicolas Maduro's survival to Vladimir Putin's grip on power. The US wants Maduro gone, while Russia keeps arming him. Why? In that triangle, Venezuela, Russia, and the West, lies the answer to why Putin is desperate to protect a Venezuelan leader who is 6,000 miles away. To understand this seemingly complex relationship, let's start at looking at what's happening on the ground right now in Caracas. Venezuela is not just going through another rough political moment. It is sliding into something sharper, and everyone watching can tell the ground is shifting fast. The election fight from last year cracked the country wide open in a new way. Maduro says he won, while the opposition says he stole it. Now people pour into the streets every night, making noise that rolls through whole neighborhoods. Soldiers try to stand firm, but the truth is the ranks are split. Some officers cling to Maduro because their futures, well, they depend on him. Others feel the strain of the shortages, the long queues, and the quiet anger building in their own families. And you already know that once the military starts to divide, the government above it begins to wobble. And Maduro certainly feels that wobble. You can see it in how he keeps shrinking his inner circle. Meetings are shorter, the room is smaller, and the trust he once had has thinned out. He keeps changing security teams and shutting down old allies he used to rely on. That kind of behavior spreads a cold feeling through a system, and it hits the average Venezuelan even harder as the economy keeps finding new lows. Inflation is still eating through salaries. Food is hard to afford, and power cuts can hit without warning. Hospitals struggle to keep basic supplies, and even simple medicine becomes something people must search for. When life gets this unstable, people start looking for any way to survive. And that opens the door to an underground economy that grows stronger each year. One part of that economy is the drug trade. When formal jobs disappear and the currency crashes, smuggling becomes a lifeline for some communities. Groups linked to parts of the military take cuts from shipments. And corrupt officials look away because the state no longer has the power or the money to control everything. And because of this, over time, Venezuela turned into a major route for cocaine heading to the US. By 2019 and 2020, American officials were pointing to Venezuela as a key gateway for drugs reaching the cities. They estimated that nearly 210 metric tons of cocaine were trafficked through Venezuela each year, much of it bound for the United States. That was connected to the high overdose numbers that were climbing across the US, and pressure grew on Washington to act. This is where the Trump administration stepped in with force. They were not interested in soft diplomacy. They wanted to make Maduro feel the heat. Sanctions hit the oil sector again and again. Banking channels were closed off. Then came the move that shook the region. Washington didn't just sanction Maduro, it branded him and several of his top officials as narco-terrorists and put a bounty on his head. At first, the reward was $15 million, already a staggering figure for a sitting head of state. But this year, that number has climbed to $50 million, making Maduro one of the most wanted men in the world. The message is unmistakable. Suppose you are a Venezuelan general with property abroad, bank accounts in Miami, or relatives living in the US. In that case, you suddenly have to weigh your loyalty against the risk of being tied to a leader facing criminal charges in another country. The bounty is not just about arresting Maduro. It's about planting doubt inside of his own military, forcing officers to ask themselves how far are they willing to go for a man who has become both a dictator and a fugitive in the eyes of Washington. The United States has backed this pressure with a real presence on the water. Naval and Coast Guard ships continue to patrol near Venezuela, making it clear that Washington is serious. On November 16th, the arrival of the USS Gerald R. Ford, America's most advanced aircraft carrier, along with its strike group, showed that this is far more than symbolic patrols. With destroyers, fighter squadrons, and maritime surveillance planes in place, the blockade carries real weight and sends a strong signal that the US is ready to enforce its stance. This is not just about politics. It connects directly to problems at home, from drug routes feeding into American cities to rising overdose numbers, and the belief that Maduro's government has turned into something closer to a criminal network. Whether people agree with Washington's approach or not, the message is hard to miss. The United States is not going to step back. Russia has seen all of this and moved in the opposite direction, choosing to support and strengthen Venezuela. Moscow has leaned in, sending cargo planes with spare parts, instructors for radar systems, and technical teams to keep Venezuela's old Soviet-era equipment alive. In 2023 and late 2024, Russian ships docked in Venezuelan ports at moments when tensions were already rising. And this year, the support has gone further. In May, Maduro met Putin in Moscow to request military help. And by November, Russian air defense systems such as Pantsir and Buk batteries were being delivered to Caracas. These deployments were never meant to win a war. They were meant to send a message. Russia wants to show it can still influence events far from its borders, even in a region the United States considers its backyard. That kind of symbolism matters to the Kremlin, because its global image is tied to strength, reach, and loyalty to allies. All of this is why this moment feels different. It's not just another crisis inside one country. It is a collision of interests. Venezuela is struggling to stay upright, and Russia is fighting to protect what influence it still has in Latin America. The United States is pushing from the other side because of drugs, politics, and the belief that Maduro crosses several lines. The more these forces press in, the more pressure builds around a country already stretched thin. So much attention for one country in Latin America, don't you think? That's why, to truly understand how Venezuela became the center of this global tug-of-war, we have to look at what lies beneath its soil: oil. And that's where the real story starts. Venezuela isn't just another oil country, it is the oil country. It sits on 303 billion barrels of proven reserves. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than anyone. If you drained every drop Venezuela has officially counted, you could fill a chain of tankers long enough to circle the Earth. That's how big its supplies are. Any country with that kind of energy potential will always matter, even when its economy is collapsing and its politics are in chaos. The only reason Venezuela has not been using this advantage is that its oil industry long since fell apart. Years of corruption, mismanagement, and sanctions left wells idle, pipelines broken, and workers fleeing in search of stable pay. The nature of Venezuela's oil adds another twist to the story. Most of that oil is heavy and thick, full of sulfur, the kind that sticks to the bottom of the barrel. It's not the light, sweet crude that flows easily. It needs special chemicals called diluents to even move through a pipeline, and it needs complex refineries to turn it into gasoline or diesel. Guess who built a whole coastline of exactly those kinds of refineries decades ago? The United States Gulf Coast. Places like Houston, Lake Charles, the Corpus Christi, have giant plants that were literally designed around Venezuelan crude. The pipes, the cokers, the workers, everything is already there, just waiting for the green light. For years, those refineries relied on Venezuelan crude as their main feedstock. Then the political relationship collapsed. Sanctions cut off the flow, and a supply chain that has been stable for generations was suddenly broken. Even with all the turmoil, the global energy world never stopped watching. In recent years, small signs of recovery began to appear. Firms from Asia and the Middle East have stepped in with technical support. A few American companies have even received limited waivers to explore deals, testing the waters in case political conditions shifted. The biggest name already in the room is Chevron. Since late 2022, they have been legally pumping oil with PDVSA under a special Treasury license, a license the Trump administration quietly expanded again in 2025. 4 joint ventures are running right now, adding almost 200,000 barrels a day that flow straight to the Gulf Coast. That oil is already on the market, already competing with Russian Urals, and Maduro is still very much in the Miraflores palace. Washington learned the hard way that total sanctions just pushed Venezuela deeper into the arms of Moscow and Beijing. So the current play is more carrot than stick. Let Chevron turn the valves a little, just a little, keep the refineries happy, and hope the extra cash convinces a few generals that life after Maduro might pay better. It is not a flood yet, but it proves the spigot can be opened without regime change first. None of this has brought Venezuela back to its old highs, but it has changed something important. The country stopped falling and started holding its ground, and that alone made analysts sit up a little straighter. That shift is now turning into something more. Venezuela is showing signs of waking up again. Its oil fields, once silent and rusting, are slowly pushing production back towards 1 million barrels a day. It is still a fragile recovery, but in a tight global market, even a hint of new supply can send traders scrambling. People on Wall Street and in energy hubs know something important. If Venezuela gets real investment and modern technology, this slow climb can turn into a surge. Just the possibility of that is already shifting expectations and making markets lean forward. That is precisely why Washington is paying attention. Inside the Trump administration, officials see more than a troubled country trying to get back on its feet. They see a doorway into a larger geopolitical game. To them, Venezuela is the perfect pressure point. Bring its barrels back into the global system, and you reshape the oil map in a way that hurts Russia without ever touching a battlefield. Every Venezuelan barrel returning to the market is one less opportunity for Moscow to sell crude at a premium. At that same time, restoring access to Venezuelan heavy crude helps U.S. refineries run more smoothly, calms price spikes at home, and steadies supply chains that sanctions and wars have shaken. One move hits three targets. It squeezes the Kremlin, strengthens America's energy position, and warns the world that long-term aggression causes long-term consequences. The pressure on the Kremlin does not just come from politics or shifting alliances. It comes from something colder, something that does not care who is giving speeches in Moscow. It is the simple math of the oil market. No theatrics, no room to improvise, just numbers that either work or don't. This is the part that Putin fears the most, because it strips away all the noise and leaves him exposed. When people talk about Venezuelan oil coming back into the global supply, they are not imagining a gentle increase that the world quietly absorbs. They're talking about a direct challenge to Russian crude. Venezuelan oil is heavy and dense, the same type many refineries use to process Russian Urals. So if Caracas stabilizes and starts pumping again, every extra barrel they ship out is basically a barrel Moscow loses. And once you look at the possible production paths, the picture gets uncomfortable for the Kremlin fast. Even the mild scenario creates pressure. If Venezuela adds 500,000 barrels a day, it cuts into Russia's customer base at a time when Moscow is already slashing prices just to stay in the game. If Venezuela climbs to a full 1,000,000 barrels, Russia has to fight harder for buyers in a market that cannot support two countries selling discounted crude at the same time. And if Caracas somehow pushes towards 1.5 million, the shock hits Moscow like a Mike Tyson punch to the ribs. Because at that point, it stops being a conversation about market share, it becomes a question of price. A meaningful Venezuelan return could pull global prices down by $10 to $20 a barrel. That's not a minor swing. That is the difference between Russia balancing its books and watching tens of billions evaporate. If the rougher projections, the losses drift towards the 100 billion mark, there is no patriotic speech in the world that can cover that kind of hole. And when energy supply shifts, everything around it starts to move. American refiners who have spent years improvising without their Venezuelan feedstock suddenly gets the perfect match back. India and China, who have been buying Russian crude mostly because of the discounts being irresistible, start seeing an easier option. Washington's secondary sanctions already makes life uncomfortable for anyone dealing with Russian oil, as every major buyer knows that getting tangled in those penalties could shut them out of the US's financial system. India and China kept buying because the discounts were massive and the alternatives were messy. But if Venezuela becomes stable, well-supplied, and openly supported by the US, the decision becomes pretty simple. They will not need to dodge sanctions anymore. They will not need to rely on shadow fleets or middlemen. They can just buy from Venezuela, cleanly and cheaply. And buyers switch fast when the risk drops and the convenience goes up. And once Venezuelan oil begins shifting the global balance, the ripple does not stop at Russia. It starts hitting the rest of the energy world almost immediately. That is where the next complication enters. For years, Saudi Arabia and Russia have tried to act like co-managers of the oil market through OPEC+. It has always been a fragile partnership. If fresh Venezuelan supply pushes prices down, Riyadh will have to move quickly to protect its interests. The Saudis care far more about price stability than political friendships. And if Russia becomes the reason their strategy stops working, the friction grows fast. While all that plays out, Latin America will likely start adjusting too. If Maduro's system weakens or collapses, the region will react in real time. Refugee pressure on neighbors will ease. Cuba and Nicaragua will lose their discounted Venezuelan fuel, and Brazil will step forward as the natural anchor in the hemisphere. And as Washington rebuilds influence in the region, the political space Russia once slipped into through Caracas will begin to shrink. And while we're still on the subject of regional affairs, another tension point sits right across the border in Guyana. Maduro keeps stirring the pot over the Essequibo region, sending troops to the frontier and holding referendums nobody asked for. Every time he does, Brazil shifts its forces. Exxon tightens security on its offshore platforms, and the neighborhood gets jumpy. If he pushes too hard, Venezuela could face a regional blockade or new waves of sanctions that choke the oil recovery the world is counting on. A cornered Maduro might even gamble that threatening Guyana rallies the country or gives him leverage. It is a live wire. One wrong move delays or damages the comeback that Washington believes can reshape the energy map. Russia quietly hopes for just enough tension to keep the West cautious, but not enough to ignite a real war. Chaos is cheaper than victory. And beyond the region, the shockwaves keep moving. When Russia earns less from oil, its overseas projects tighten. Support for proxies in Africa, Syria, and Central Asia become harder to maintain. These operations were never massive line items, but they still needed steady funding. And Russia's reach was already stretched thin before any of this. Sanctions, battlefield losses, and a slowing economy have been chipping away at it for years. A Venezuelan surge does not create the decline, it speeds it up. Influence rarely collapses in one dramatic moment. It fades slowly, and each fading line makes the Kremlin feel a little more boxed in. Russia feels this pressure more sharply than it wants to admit. Oil is not just one of Moscow's exports, it is the pillar holding up the entire state. Roughly a third of the Russian government's budget depends on energy revenue. That money keeps the military moving, funds the security services, pays the propagandists, and supports social programs designed to keep people quiet. Every missile launch in Ukraine, every armored vehicle on the front line, every well-produced victory story on state TV is powered by oil dollars flowing into Kremlin accounts. The trouble is, these dollars are getting harder to earn. Costs are rising. Sanctions complicate almost every step of production and transport, and insurers hesitate to cover Russian tankers unless the price is right. Even when Moscow finds buyers, it often has to sell at a steep discount because countries like India and China know that Russia is desperate for revenue. So each shipment brings in less money than before, while the war drains cash at a pace the state cannot match. This is why even a small drop in global prices becomes a crisis for Putin. A $10 fall per barrel can wipe out tens of billions in a single year. Suddenly, the government is scrambling. When prices fall, Russia does not just feel discomfort, it feels the ground shifting under its entire political system. And once the money starts drying up, the shock doesn't stop at the federal budget. It spreads through the rest of the economy. The ruble weakens, and every drop drags inflation even higher. Everyday Russians feel it immediately, as prices rise faster than the government can steady them. Families pull back on spending, small businesses struggle to stay alive, public frustration grows, and the national mood starts to tilt. That pressure moves upward into the circles around Putin. The people closest to him argue more, blame each other more, and worry that shrinking resources could cost them influence or protection. A stressed economy exposes rivalries that the system normally hides. Those quiet tensions can turn into open conflict if the pressure lasts long enough. This is the chain reaction Putin fears the most. A drop in oil prices doesn't only shrink the war budget, it rattles the markets, weakens the currency, and shakes the confidence of the very people who hold the political structure together. Russia can push through a rough season. What it cannot survive is a long, grinding decline in energy revenue without absorbing serious political damage. Washington knows all of this. And that is why U.S. strategy is not limited to sanction pressure or diplomatic speeches. The long-term plan is to push out Maduro and replace him with a government friendly to American interests. One willing to let Western oil companies modernize Venezuela's industry. That is where Maria Corina Machado enters the scene. Not only is she a Nobel Peace Prize winner, but she's the one the US wants in Mia Flores when this is over. The one they believe can steady the country fast enough to turn the oil industry back on and start squeezing Moscow the way they've been planning for years. If that happens, production could shoot past the 1 million barrel mark and keep rising, turning Venezuela into a direct competitor to Russia in a moment when Moscow can least afford it. Armed with this reality, for Putin, the stakes could not be clearer. Holding up Maduro is not just about loyalty or influence in Latin America. It's about protecting Russia's lifeline. If Venezuela flips to the west, Moscow loses a shield, loses market share, and loses the high prices it depends on. The Kremlin simply cannot afford to lose this fight, As far as Putin and his officers are concerned, Maduro cannot fall. All of that explains why the Kremlin is fighting so hard to keep Maduro upright. But before anyone starts measuring curtains for a post-Maduro Venezuela, there's a harder truth waiting on the ground in Caracas. Because let's not kid ourselves into thinking Maduro is just gonna pack his bags and hand over the keys because the oil math looks bad for Moscow. The man has spent 25 years turning Venezuela into a fortress built for exactly this moment. Right now, the regime claims direct control of roughly 350,000 active armed forces and another 1.8 million in various militias and paramilitary collectives. The infamous colectivos. Add in the 2.5 million Bolivarian militia members who have received at least basic weapons training, and you're looking at well over 4 million people who have been told, for a decade, that the Americans are coming to kill them and steal the oil. A big chunk of that number is poorly paid and half-starved, sure, but they are armed, organized, and ideologically drilled into seeing any transition as the end of their world. On top of that, Cuban intelligence still runs half the counterintelligence inside the Venezuelan security apparatus. Russian private military contractors are embedded with key units. And Iran has quietly shipped in fast boat swarms and drone instructors. The palace isn't defended by a lonely dictator and a couple of nervous generals. It's defended by a layered, paranoid ecosystem that has been preparing for street-by-street, block-by-block urban warfare in Caracas since 2017. And if the US ever crosses the line from sanctions and carrier demos to something that looks like direct intervention, special forces, funding for an armed opposition push, or worse, Maduro has already telegraphed the play. He will turn Venezuela into a Caribbean Syria. Burn the oil fields, flood the cities with armed loyalists, open the prisons, and dare Washington to send American boys into the valleys and barrios where every apartment block is a potential ambush. The Pentagon knows it. That's why every war game on regime collapse in Caracas ends with 5 to 6-figure US troop commitments and a decade-long counterinsurgency bill that makes Afghanistan look cheap. So yes, the economic noose is tightening, the military is cracking, and the oil prize is glittering. But turning that pressure into actual regime change still means walking through a wall of 4 million desperate, radicalized people who have nothing left to lose, and a lot of people teaching them how to bleed an invading army slowly. That's not a weekend operation. That's a war the United States has zero domestic appetite for in 2025. That's not to say that Trump won't absolutely bulldoze through this obstacle, but this adds another layer of considerations that simply states that this will not be a walk in the park. Beyond the oil and money, Maduro provides Russia a rare strategic advantage. He gives Moscow a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, one of the few places close to the United States where Russia still has a real partner. For the Kremlin, that's not just a symbolic win. It is a reminder that Russia can still show up in America's neighborhood and cause trouble if it wants to. It helps Moscow pretend its global reach is still wide, even if that reach keeps shrinking everywhere else. And this partnership did not appear out of nowhere. It was built piece by piece over years of military cooperation. Russia sold jets, helicopters, and air defense systems to Venezuela long before the current crisis. Many of those systems are now old, but they still matter, because they need Russian technicians to keep them running. When something breaks, Venezuela cannot fix it alone. They have to call Moscow. That dependence creates a tie that does not break easily, even when Russia is stretched thin. Then there's the money side, which is even more serious. Russia has loaned Venezuela billions. Some of those loans came directly from the Kremlin. Others came through Rosneft, which took pieces of Venezuelan oil projects as collateral. A few oligarchs even parked their own money in risky deals tied to Venezuela's energy sector. All of that creates a wide web of financial obligations. If Maduro falls, a lot of that money disappears. That's a hit Moscow cannot afford right now. Not with a war draining its budget and sanctions squeezing every corner of its economy. But this is where things get uncomfortable for the Kremlin. Russia cannot support Venezuela the way it used to. The war in Ukraine has stripped away extra manpower, extra equipment, and extra attention. Most of the help Russia sends today is more for show than anything else. A ship visit here, a cargo plane landing there, and a handful of advisors on the ground. It looks strong from a distance, but up close, it's clear Moscow is mostly trying to keep up appearances. And there is one more worry floating around Putin's circle, one they rarely say out loud. If Maduro goes down, he might try to run to Russia. Now, it sounds dramatic, but the rumor has been around for years, and honestly, it scares the Kremlin. Hosting another fallen leader would not make Russia look powerful. It would make it look like a retirement home for failed strongmen. It would put Maduro in the same boat as Yanukovych, Bashar al-Assad, and others who have fled to Moscow when things fell apart. It would show the world that yet another one of Russia's allies collapsed on Putin's watch. That's why the Kremlin refuses to let go. This brings us back to Putin himself, because all of these global ripples eventually converge on one target: him. You see, once the oil money starts shrinking, the shock will spread everywhere at once. Factories that build tanks, missiles, and armored vehicles will slow down because the steel, electronics, and funding they rely on will be harder to secure. Social programs that keep towns steady will begin to falter, leaving families anxious and local officials scrambling. Regional budgets will tighten, and governors will be forced to make choices they never wanted to face. Even the Kremlin's ability to buy loyalty, the invisible glue that holds the system together, will weaken at the very moment it is needed the most. That is when the cracks will start to show. Hardliners will start to whisper that Putin misread the map. Oligarchs will panic as their fortunes shrink with the economy. Governors who have always balanced loyalty with self-preservation will begin to keep their distance. The system will not collapse in one dramatic moment. Instead, it will shake in hundreds of small tremors, each one almost invisible, but each one chipping away at the authority Putin has built over decades. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine is already stretching Russia to its limits. Soldiers are exhausted, equipment is wearing out, and supply lines are under constant pressure. Every advance costs enormous resources, and Moscow is struggling to keep the pace. If oil revenues fall, that struggle will turn into a full-blown crisis. Factories that produce weapons will falter. Soldiers will go unpaid at a worse rate than what's happening. Convoys will break down and supply chains will fail. The war will become impossible to sustain at the pace Putin demands, especially when Ukraine is backed by a coalition of countries, providing money, intelligence, and advanced equipment. Russia cannot fight on borrowed strength forever, and running out of cash while the enemy is fully supplied will be catastrophic. That will spell danger. And that danger will not only be on the battlefield. It will be personal to Putin. In a system built on fear and transactional loyalty, weakness is a non-starter. Simply put, this situation can create the gap needed for him to be ousted by his own people, if the cards fall just right. So the situation's stakes are much deeper than they initially appear to be. None of this means Venezuela's comeback will topple the Kremlin overnight. In fact, even if tomorrow a new government throws the doors open to Exxon and Chevron with no strings attached, most serious analysts say that you're still looking at 5 to 8 years before production cracks 2 million barrels a day once again. So this entire process takes time. But what it also does is speeds up the pressures already building inside Russia. Each weak spot gets sharper, each risk harder to ignore, and the slow erosion of power starts to feel urgent. At the center of it all is the one resource Putin has always counted on to shield his regime: oil. Once his greatest weapon is quietly turning into the thing that could undo him. Venezuela was never just a distant crisis or a troubled state in the Caribbean. Its oil sits at the heart of a chain reaction that reaches far beyond its borders. Every barrel coming back online nudges energy markets, rattles alliances, and forces powerful countries to adjust. This is not about supply charts or spreadsheets. It's about real-world political consequences, and they arrive fast. If Washington manages to reshape Venezuela's path, the effects hit Moscow almost immediately and weaken the systems keeping Putin in power. In the end, the message is simple. Venezuela isn't a side story. It's a fuse running all the way to Moscow. And if that fuse is lit, Venezuela's oil could become the unexpected weapon that weakens Russia's regime at its core.